A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
When I found out my husband cheated on me, it felt like the floor dropped away beneath my feet, and everything we'd built over the years crumbled into a pile of shattered dreams and memories sharp enough to cut. Telling him I knew was the hardest moment of my life, he looked me straight in the eyes, his pupils dilating like a secret was a curse he couldn't handle, and for a moment, I thought I could see something flicker behind that familiar facade, something dark, something alive. After that confrontation, he changed. The warm, affectionate man I'd loved suddenly seemed like a stranger inhabiting his own skin. At first, it was subtle, a missed dinner, a half-hearted excuse to stay late at work, but then he started doing things that were outright bizarre. He'd sit up in the middle of the night, staring into the darkness, muttering something under his breath that I couldn't quite make out. At first, I thought it was guilt, but then a chill slithered down my spine. It was as if he was channeling someone else, a spirit that inhabited him only during those late hours, and in the morning, he'd act like nothing had transpired, the vacant smile barely masking the upheaval roiling within him. The way he looked at me shifted too, there was a mixture of pity and fear, like he was scared I'd see through him, and I found myself wondering if I was witnessing the aftermath of his betrayal bleed into something inexplicable. I started watching him more closely, dissecting every little oddity. Why did he insist on wearing that old jacket of his from college, the one that smelled like stale cigarettes and damp wool? And why did he take long walks at odd hours, returning with a strange, unshakable energy that left me feeling hollow, like the person I loved had been replaced by someone who didn't belong? Each day, the shadows of familiarity warped the reality around him, weaving a tapestry of paranoia in my mind like I was trapped in a dark fairy tale gone wrong. I began to see things that couldn't possibly be real, like the time I found him in our bedroom, staring at an old photo of us, tears streaming down his cheeks while he whispered a name I didn't recognize. It was like he was grieving a ghost I'd never met. I confronted him about it, my voice trembling with rage and confusion, but he shook his head, eyes darting around as if he expected someone to materialize behind me. Over time, I became convinced he was sleeping with someone else, an eerie echo of a ghost, taunting me from within him, as if the weight of his betrayal had beckoned something dark, some ancient force that now had a hold over him. I searched through his belongings to find proof, anything that would expose him, but it was in those searches that I stumbled upon an old, leather-bound journal hidden in the back of his closet, the pages frail and yellowed with time. As I flipped through the words, my heart raced. They were written in a shaky hand that detailed encounters and incantations, rituals meant to summon souls from the afterlife, filled with a longing that made my skin crawl. "I'm sorry," the last entry read, "but not to me." No, it was a plea to something else, something ancient, something that had taken root in his heart, perhaps even before our marriage. I realized then that he wasn't just haunted by guilt, he had crossed a forbidden line, and I was living with whatever darkness had seeped in during his dalliance. The next evening, I stood at the bedroom door, watching him sift through the journal under the soft light, murmuring words I couldn't quite understand, the air growing thick and cold around me as he seemingly descended deeper into this ritualistic trance. "John," I called out, my voice barely a whisper, and he froze, the light catching in his eyes and making them flare with an unnerving shimmer. He turned to me, but it was like I was looking at a stranger behind his eyes, something ancient and hungry lurking just below the surface. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice a low growl that sent shivers racing down my spine. I stumbled backward as he advanced, as if I were an intruder in our own home. Now, desperation clawed at my insides. I had to get out, but even the thought of leaving him had become a labyrinthine terror, twisting my heart with dread. I spent the night wandering the house, hoping to sense the familiar warmth of our love, but it becoming increasingly barren. The walls felt alive, whispering secrets and threats, the very air heavy with something I could no longer bear. Days turned into a week, and my husband became more unreachable, fragmented, both the husband and the specter of something else. I couldn't be sure he hadn't physically changed, but every glance felt like a veil being pulled back, revealing the monstrous reality I had stumbled into. That night, I gathered the courage to confront him one final time. I found him standing in the living room, swaying as if in a trance, the shadows swirling around him in a dance that made my breath hitch. He turned slowly, and for the first time, I saw the complete absence of recognition. "She told me I had to do this," he said, voice laced with an unsettling calm, eyes gleaming with a fervor I had never seen before. "I have to bring her back." It was at that moment I understood, the woman he had cheated on me with wasn't alive anymore, she was a spirit, something he had tried to reclaim through dark means. "You're not bringing anyone back," I screamed, panic ripping through me, but it felt as if he was already lost to me, spiraling deeper into his obsession. I had underestimated the power of what he had meddled with. There was a thin line between love and madness, and now, I feared I was about to cross it. With every beat of my heart, a decision coiled tight within me, and I finally bolted for the door, fleeing from the home we had built together. But as I reached for the doorknob, I heard him call my name, a haunting echo that sent a shockwave of dread through me. "You can't escape her," he said, and the shadows congealed at his feet, swirling like smoke. "She will always be part of me." I crashed through the door and the chill of the night air enveloped me, but it wasn't enough. The darkness followed, an intangible force chasing me down the street as I looked back toward the house one last time, seeing his silhouette standing in the doorway, a ghost rising in a home that was no longer ours. I could feel the weight of it on my shoulders, an unseen shackle binding me to someone who was no longer my husband, trapped in a web of loss that made every night a new horror show. I don't know how long I can run, but even now, when the sun dips and the shadows stretch long, something whispers my name, pulling me back to the dark. I've already made my choice, but I fear it may not be the last, and in this quiet town where the line between the living and the dead has thinned, I can only wonder how many other souls have become lost to their darkness. It was a chilly evening when I first saw her, a woman pushing a baby pram down the deserted street near my apartment. The glow of the street lamps illuminated the cobblestones, casting a yellow haze that struggled against the encroaching darkness, and as I peered through my window, something about the image froze me in place. The pram was too large, the fabric too heavy, clinging like a shroud around whatever lay inside, and while my instinct told me to look away, I couldn't. She walked slowly, purposefully, her gait steady yet unhurried, the wheels of the pram creaking softly, almost as if they were whispering secrets of their own, and the night was silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves shaken by a breeze that felt too much like a warning. I told myself I was being irrational, that it was just a mother tending to her child, but as she passed beneath the flickering street lamp, I caught a glimpse of her face, pale as the moon, an unsettling, almost serene emptiness in her eyes that sent a shiver spiraling down my spine. And then there was a sound, a soft cooing, yet it didn't sound quite right. It was a gurgle that echoed too deep, a sound that threaded through the still air like a whisper from the grave. For the next few nights, I found myself drawn back to that window, curiosity battling the gnawing dread in my gut, and every time I looked, she was there, the same steady push of the pram, enveloped in an unnerving calmness, the shadows her only companions. It was on the fourth night that I mustered the courage to step outside, my heart thrumming wildly in my chest as I slipped through my apartment door, half expecting the woman to have vanished into the ether, but there she was again, the eerie presence of both her and the pram practically calling to me, and I felt compelled to follow, distance growing between us as I shuffled down the sidewalk, trying to remain hidden in the darkened corners of the street. There was something wrong with that pram, an oppressive energy radiating from it, pulling me closer and yet holding me at bay, and the more I walked, the more I struggled to shake the feeling that I was crossing an invisible line into a world I didn't belong in. I reached a park filled with shadows and flickering lights, where the branches of old trees clawed at the night sky, and there she stopped, positioning the pram near a rusting, gnarled bench, and I crouched behind a cluster of bushes, every sense tingling with fear as I fought to stay quiet, heart hammering in my ears as the woman leaned over the pram. And that's when I saw it, the horrid movement within, the blanket shifting, twitching, as if whatever was inside were straining against its confines, and the cooing turned into low, guttural noises, a strange, wet sound, like something that came from the deepest part of nightmares. I held my breath, feeling the warmth of the world seep away, replaced with a chilling realization that that wasn't the sound of a baby, it was wrong, so wrong. The woman turned her head abruptly, glancing in my direction, and for a moment, I swore our gazes locked, ice spreading in my veins at the intensity of her stare, a predator measuring its prey. She made a soft noise, not quite a laugh, not a gasp either, but something in between, her lips curling in a way that left me hollow as she resumed her vigil over the pram, oblivious to the fact that I was still there, quaking in my hiding place, and then the creature inside began to shriek, a spine-chilling wail that cut through the air and reverberated in my bones. It was a sound that begged for mercy and delivered terror, and as I watched, transfixed, the blanket began to shift more violently, a clawed hand bursting through, impossibly thin and veined, suggesting a body that no mortal child should possess. Panic surged through me, overruling any rational thought, and I stumbled backward, catching my foot on a tree root and tripping with a sickening thud as I fell to the ground. I pressed myself against the earth, heart racing, breath coming in choking gasps, praying she hadn't noticed, but the world stood still, and as I dared to peep through the foliage, I saw her staring, her expression unreadable as the shrieking intensified, the pram beginning to shake uncontrollably as if an unseen force was trying to escape. Then, she began to chant in a low, melodic voice, words that were strangled and twisted, wrapping around the air like a dark spell, and in that moment, the feeling of dread I had been suppressing struck me full force. I was witnessing something beyond comprehension, and I needed to run. But my body wouldn't cooperate, heavy with fear, paralyzed while I watched that hand reach further out of the pram, raw and bloody fingers gripping the edge of the blanket, revealing scales and slithering surfaces that screamed of the abyss. Just as I thought I might scream myself into oblivion, she suddenly turned back to the pram, her hands moving in a way that suggested she was urging it forward, pleading with whatever lay entangled within to yield and be still. It let out another horrid cry that echoed through the park, the sound distorting and twisting until it morphed into what could only be the voice of a grown man, guttural and demanding, calling out for release, begging to be set free. Fear ripped through me, igniting adrenaline that finally unlocked my legs, and I bolted into the shadows, heart slamming against my ribs as I fled, hearing my own ragged breath drowning out everything else. I didn't stop until I was back in my apartment, locking the door behind me and pressing my back against it, the noises fading but my mind racing, trying to justify what I had seen. Days turned into weeks as I avoided that park, but I could never shake the memory. I became a ghost in my own life, marked by the horror of that night. Each evening, I sat by my window, hoping to catch a glimpse of her pram one last time, terrified and fascinated both by the darkness it represented and by my own irrational fear gripping me tighter. Then came the night I finally saw it again, her figure gliding along the street, that same unnatural calm radiating off her, yet the pram stood empty. It felt as though the world had tilted away from its axis. She approached my building, and my heart dropped as she stopped directly outside my window, just staring into the void as if sensing me, the pulse of terror rushing through my blood igniting every warning bell in my mind. The pram, a vessel of shadows, sat without its horrid cargo, and in the silence of that moment, I felt it, a cold hand brushing against the back of my neck, and I knew without a doubt that whatever she had brought into this world was now looking straight at me. We were woven together in the fabric of darkness, and there was no escape. When I was 8, my older brother, Alex, passed away in a car accident. My world shattered in an instant. He was my protector, my confidant, my best friend, and I didn't know how to live in a world without him, until the night I first heard his voice again, beckoning from the shadows of my grief. It began as a whisper in the stillness after I had cried myself to sleep, an echo so familiar it pierced the fog of my sorrow. "It's okay, Sam, I'm still here." I jolted awake, heart racing, convinced I was dreaming until his soft laughter filled the room, an ethereal melody that wrapped around me like a warm blanket. Alex had a way of making everything feel safe, and I wanted desperately to believe it was him, to reach out and embrace the intangible. From that night on, our conversations surged from the depths of my longing. I would sit atop my bed, the curtain billowing gently as I kept vigil for his return, and he came, with tales that stirred my imagination and filled the void he left behind, telling me about the world beyond death in vibrant colors that danced in my mind, how time slipped through the fingers of the departed like sand, how he met people who had once walked the earth, now shadows of their former selves living in an endless twilight. He shared secrets about the afterlife. He said it was a place of peace where pain couldn't reach us and laughter echoed through the corridors of eternity, filling my heart with a bittersweet melody that belied my waking sorrow. Alex became my guide, the comforting voice that reminded me I was never truly alone. I would ask him questions, curious little probes into the abyss, hoping for hints about his death, but all I got was vague reassurance, almost as if he was protecting me from the darker truth that lingered just beyond the veil. With every secret he shared, I felt bolder, more alive, as if I too could transcend the limitations of my fragile existence. He talked about memories, names etched into the fabric of the universe, and the hidden strength he found in letting go. But as months turned into a year, I started to notice something unsettling. Each visit from Alex seemed heavier, as if the toll of his existence on the other side was more burdensome than I'd realized. The once vibrant details in his stories began to fade, as if they were being lost to time itself. smudging the colors of our shared dreamscape. His laughter became strained, and instead of discussing the wonders beyond death, he would speak in fractured fragments, hints of things left unsaid, his tone dropping into darker territory. He'd ominously mention a veil that some should not cross, a murky reflection of the life we couldn't touch, and as the chills settled in my bones, I clutched my bedspread, desperate to keep the fading warmth of our connection alive. One night, I dared to ask about the accident, my heart pounding as the air thickened with an unsettling silence. He responded with a warning that sent chills shooting up my spine, urging me to never seek the truth too deeply, as if he knew there were edges to reality we weren't meant to tamper with. I didn't listen. Instead, I began digging through family memories, pulling at threads of the past, growing obsessed with unraveling the mystery surrounding Alex's death. I spoke to my parents, but they clammed up whenever the topic arose, and I noticed glimpses of fear flash across their faces, that only fueled my determination until one haunted afternoon, I stumbled upon a faded newspaper article buried in a box that detailed the crash, a blur of broken glass and twisted metal, but more importantly, I noticed a name that didn't belong to anyone I knew. Panic gripped my heart, and for the first time, I felt an upper world collapse around me as shadows lengthened in my room. I rushed back to my sanctuary, desperate for guidance. When I called out to him, the silence stretched and curled like smoke, and dread settled in the bones of my being. "Alex?" I whispered, but the darkness answered with an unsettling void, the comfort of his presence replaced by a haunting chill that seeped into my soul, and his absence echoed louder than any words. The following nights were agonizing, sleep evaded me, and when I finally drifted off, I was met with nightmares that turned my dreams into monstrous reflections of my fears, blending the past and the present into nightmarish parodies of reality. I could feel Alex drawing closer, but there was a disquieting presence that flitted just beyond, a gnawing sensation of being watched, and the whispers turned into cries for help, a cacophony of terrified souls crying out from shadows, begging to be freed. I awoke every morning overwhelmed by a new sense of dread, an inexplicable sense that I had awakened something I was never meant to find. I felt Alex slipping away, losing his warmth, and in its place, something cold and malevolent was coiling around my heart. Desperate, I confronted the mirrors of my life, searching for the connection that had once lit up my darkness, until one fateful night, tearing through the paper-thin veil between dreams and reality, I finally saw him, the real Alex, not the brother I had known and loved, but a kinder echo being twisted by something much darker. "What did you do?" I pleaded, my voice trembling, terror clawing at my throat as I caught a glimpse of the name I had found, an inexplicable bond shadowing our souls, and in those eyes, I saw the truth behind the calm facade he had built. "You shouldn't have looked," he whispered, voice distorted, tainted with a pain that vibrated through my core. The warm laughter of my memories turned hollow and sinister, and I knew then I had crossed too far. I had taken a step into the abyss without knowing what lay beneath. As he faded back into the darkness, the heaviness of his absence pressed down on me, and I understood the truth he had tried to protect me from. Sometimes, the living shouldn't seek out the lost, and some doors should never be opened. The nightmares returned with a vengeance, unmoored from any thread of companionship, a ceaseless tide that dragged me deeper and deeper until I awoke one final time, gasping, a fine sheen of sweat coating my skin, grabbing the edges of reality, knowing I had lost Alex forever. I stared into the mirror, desperate for a shred of truth, only to find my own reflection staring back at me, eyes wide with the understanding that some connections are meant to be severed, even if it means learning to live with the pain. And as the shadows swept through the room, the darkness grinned back, promising that it would be waiting, always waiting, for another chance to snatch a glimpse of the truth buried in forgotten memories. I never thought the request would shatter our marriage, but there we were, throbbing tension thickening the air as my husband, Daniel, leaned back against the couch, his eyes aglow with excitement. "It's just a birthday gift, babe," he urged, biting his lip in that way he always did when he was trying to sell me on a questionable idea. His birthday was approaching, and I had blinded myself to the fact that he had grown restless in our 6-year marriage. I found the concept of a threesome, something I had dismissed as a frivolous fantasy, spreading a sickening pit in the stomach, but it was hard to say no to the one man who had always treated me with love and respect, the one who had painted sunsets on my heart. Yet, the more I listened, his words dripped honey-sweet yet felt like poison. When I hesitatingly agreed, a rush of nausea welled up, and I was struck by the nagging dread that I was sacrificing not just my own comfort but potentially much more. Over the next few days, I scoured the internet for advice, and the thrill of it felt almost exhilarating until I read horror stories of lovers turned roommates, friendships shattered by the weight of unfulfilled expectations. My heart raced, realizing that our intimacy was threading dangerously close to something unrecognizable. I began to think of what might go wrong. What if I got jealous or the third person didn't have chemistry with him, or worse yet, what if he liked her more than he liked me? I proposed we set boundaries, even to chat with the other women beforehand, but Daniel was adamant. Spontaneity was key, he insisted, and as foolish as it seemed, I could feel a chill creep like ivy into my mind, clawing at my insecurities, but I pushed them aside, surrendering to his wishes. We found an online ad, and when she responded, a thrill coursed through me as I read her message. Sarah, 27, adventurous, and curiously flirty. Daniel was infatuated with her instantly, reading her messages aloud like a child showcasing a shiny new toy. The day she agreed to come over, I could feel the tension coiling in the pit of my stomach like a rattlesnake about to strike. As the hour approached, I tried to talk myself into calmness, mentally pumping myself up for what was to come, but deep inside, something felt profoundly wrong. As if the universe was tipping heavy like it had taken a cruel turn, the air dense with unspoken foreboding. When Sarah arrived, she adorned a skin-tight red dress that hugged her curves with a sultry magnetism, her laughter infectious and velvety, and Daniel, his eyes gleaming with admiration, introduced her to our home like she was a long-lost goddess. They flirted effortlessly, and I was a ghost in my own home, awkwardly skirting the edge of their chemistry like a marionette with frayed strings, feeling increasingly isolated and invisible until I finally broke. Can we maybe talk about what boundaries we established before we... My voice trilled off, unrealizing that the energy around us was swirling, spiraling out of control into something wild and unearthing. Their eyes darted to mine, and in that moment, I saw a flicker of annoyance cross Daniel's face that felt like a cold dagger. Sarah too was lit with impatience, and they both dismissed me in a shared glance. As we finally crossed the threshold, my heart raced. I felt like a trembling leaf caught in a fierce gale. They were mouths hungry for each other, bodies entwining, and I was a mere spectator, feelings of loneliness washing over me like a torrential rainstorm, drowning my resolve. I could hardly breathe when he kissed her, the sensation scraping at my insides like claws meeting flesh, and I could feel him gradually withdrawing from me, as if every whispered promise he'd made was crumbling before my eyes in silence, and the desire that latterly filled the room morphed into dread. As things heated up, an idea, a surreal, terrifying thought wormed its way into my mind. What if I wasn't just losing my husband, but I was losing myself? Just as I was about to voice my concerns, the lights flickered ominously, plunging our living room into darkness for a moment that seemed to stretch beyond time, and instinct kicked in. What was that? I gasped, panic tightening my throat, but Daniel only chuckled, whispering that it was just the old wiring in the house. But the stillness that followed felt alive, encasing us in a strange tension that made me shiver in disbelief. The lights flickered back on, revealing Sarah's expression, a mix of exhilaration and something deeply unsettling. And then, as if the very atmosphere shifted, I noticed the change in Daniel's gaze. It wasn't just lust anymore, it was possessive, almost hungry, as if he was no longer my husband but a beast enthralled by a fresh kill. That flicker of humanity began to erode away, replaced by something darker, and in that moment, I realized this was no casual encounter, it was a reckoning. The room turned to chaos as they began to indulge in one another, and as if time had fractured, I felt rooted to the floor, every ounce of my emotional turmoil erupting into tangible fear. I felt the solid weight of panic clipping my senses. I was hyper-aware of every misstep, every glance, and then, as I gathered courage, I inched forward, calling out to Daniel amidst the dizzying whirl of desire that engulfed him. "This isn't what we wanted," I pleaded, my voice echoing through the thickened air. He paused suddenly, the heat of the moment waning, but his reply came twisted, caught between two worlds. "You're the one who wanted this, remember? You wanted to give me the best birthday ever." Those words crashed against me like heavy waves sinking my resolve, and in that moment, Sarah's gaze turned into an unreadable mask, and I knew deep down that darkness had seeped into our lives, consuming us with uncertainties we could never escape. Just as I felt a swift thread of panic compress my chest, something stirred inside me, a primal instinct demanding to be set free, the cries of my heart urging me to reclaim the control I had so willingly relinquished. But before I had time to enact my thoughts, Sarah reached for Daniel's hand, her smile dripping with a confidence that sent shards of ice dancing along my spine. In that same instant, the lights flickered once more, plunging us into a darkness so absolute I held my breath, and the shadows that morphed around us felt almost sentient, crawling into corners and caressing the edges of our souls. The silence, broken only by hushed whispers, carried something sinister. I realized she was no simple thrill seeker but something dark, enticing, like the very embodiment of temptation itself. The atmosphere grew heavy, almost suffocating, the shadows watching, waiting, as if the whole room held its breath, caught in a dance of primal urges and unchecked desires that poisoned the very fabric of our relationship. Suddenly, I felt it. She was drawing Daniel further under her spell, the room pulsing with a hunger that echoed my deepest fears. Was I losing him, losing myself to this whims of passion, this delusion? Yet, pain burst forth as vivid reminders clawed at my heart, forcing me to remember the promise, the love we had built in our once rosy world. My resolve hardened like iron, and as the shadows twisted, I stepped forward, breaking free of the mental shackles tying me to my insecurities. In that moment of uncertainty, clarity washed over me, and I felt a pulse of defiance surge within. "Daniel," I shouted, and the name echoed through the darkness, a plea for the man I had loved fiercely before all these entangled emotions took hold. But the flickering glow of the living room lights cast Daniel's distorted face, a mask of confusion mixed with desire, and something dark, a transformation which turned my heart into stone. Just then, the shadows leapt at me, becoming almost tangible, slipping between my fingers as I reached for him. I whimpered, feeling like a vessel captured by an unseen force, and the distance between us expanded. My heart raced as Sarah's husky laughter intertwined with Daniel's muddled words, wrapping around me like a snake, squeezing tighter until streams of icy water pooled in my eyes. I grasped at the flickering lights, hoping for clarity, a return to our love, and yet those shadows only coiled deeper around Daniel, tugging at his hungry gaze, and in that moment, I realized, this wasn't about the three of us, it was about me and the abyss I'd invited into our lives, blinding me to the darkness waiting at the edges. This was his birthday, but a rite of passage into unknown realms, something darker than I could ever have imagined, and as panic clawed at my insides, I felt a despair I had never known. This was my last call to salvage what spark we had left, and I stepped forward, a wave of courage surging through, trembling yet firm. "I'm not backing down from this, Daniel, I'm still here. And I want the man I married." But as the seconds dragged, shadows danced around us, blocking my view, entering our skins, and my heart plummeted, exhausting like flames of uncertainty bludgeoning the resolve of love. In a cold realization, I understood that I wasn't just fighting for Daniel, I was fighting for the whisper of the woman I had once been, the wife who smiled in innocence, and the realization hit, our marriage was not swiftly disappearing into the night, it was on the precipice of something unspeakable, caught between lust and the wicked waltz of choices made. Desperate, I reached deep into the memory of our happiest moments, drawing upon the essence of our love, and as another flicker plunged us into momentary darkness, I whispered his name again, my voice breaking, "We can overcome this. You can come back to me." But like a resonating echo, only silence answered, and suddenly, the lights surged back to blinding brightness to reveal Sarah woven into his arms, entangled in a mess of comfort and illicit desire, their connection an unmistakable bond I was locked out from, trapped between passion and fear of abandonment. I staggered back, breath hitching in my throat, my heart splintering under the weight of abandon as the reality washed over me. Daniel was not just lost in lust, but willingly entwined in shadows beyond what we had ever shared, entrapped in a dark craving harboring the slightest of threads that shouted despair, and I realized, staring into an abyss of my own disillusion, that I had opened a door best left locked, a Pandora's box of perils, leaving potential devastation lurking on the threshold. It started as a joke, a way to pass the time during one of those mundane, rainy Saturdays when nothing seemed appealing, and we stumbled across an old board game in my attic. Its faded box, slightly tattered and covered in dust, bore a worn-out inscription, "The Infinite Game, where endless possibilities await." Initially, we laughed at the silly title, but curiosity got the better of us, and we gathered around the table, cracking jokes as we arranged the pieces. The rules were convoluted, almost nonsensical, but their absurdity only fueled our enthusiasm. It was a simple game at first. We rolled dice, moved our pieces, and drew cards that promised everything from fortune to disaster, but then the stakes began to rise in a way none of us could have predicted. We played for hours, and as day turned to night, The atmosphere shifted. Shadows danced in the corners of the room, flickering and stretching unnaturally as if they were alive. My friend Lucy, always the skeptic, laughed it off, but a chill crawled up my spine. I shrugged it away, for who wouldn't get creeped out by an old game? Yet, when Simon drew a card that read "Lose a friend," we all paused. It wasn't potentially concerning, not really, but to our horror, Lucy received a frantic call from her younger brother minutes later, revealing he'd been in a terrible accident. He didn't make it. We were shaken, but we convinced ourselves it was just a coincidence. Surely, people draw bad cards all the time without consequence, right? We kept playing, drawn deeper into the obscure allure of the infinite game, convinced it was an adventure, something we could laugh about one day. But 1 week turned into 2, and 2 weeks morphed into a month as we became more consumed with the game. We started tearing through our lives. I lost my job after a series of uncharacteristic mistakes. Simon's girlfriend dumped him after he neglected her like he was trapped in a bubble, and even Jenna, who seemed to be breezing through, discovered she had an inexplicable fear of crossing streets, an event that escalated after she drew the fear of the streets card. It was a constant whirlpool of odd events and spiraling misfortunes, but despite the consequences, we couldn't stop playing. We thought of it as a bonding activity, a challenge that forged our friendship closer, but with every roll of the dice, the game grew darker, more sinister. The absurdity of its whimsy morphed into a morose reflection of our lives, echoing our misfortunes under the guise of entertainment. We began to notice sinister patterns. Every time we drew a card that boasted ridiculous promises, a corresponding mishap would occur soon after. Simon's fortune card didn't lead to wealth. Instead, it meant he would catch an unshakable flu for weeks. One night, fueled by desperation and the fading grasp on reality, I suggested we take a break, but my friends, a twisted look in their eyes, vehemently opposed me. "It keeps getting better," Jenna insisted. Though she trembled slightly, her voice thin, as if the weight of the game was suffocating her. So we played on until my apartment felt like a prison, suffocating under the endless cycle of luck and despair. It was during one of those long nights that the game revealed its most disturbing feature. A new card appeared, unlike anything we had seen before, golden, embossed, and scandalous. It read, "Sacrifice," and its instructions were vague yet chilling. "One must become the game." We laughed nervously at first, but then the air grew heavy, and an inexplicable tension set in. In a moment of collective madness, with laughter bubbling dangerously into panic, we each took a gamble. We hesitated, but something felt darkly enticing about surrendering our will. Within a sharp inhale, the die clattered on the board, and the lights flickered. Everything changed. I remember the fear in Simon's eyes as he suddenly turned uncharacteristically militant, saying only, "We can't go back now." Jenna and Lucy watched him just as bewildered, yet an invisible thread seemed to weave us tighter together in the game's fateful grip. Hours turned to days with no sense of time, and with each passing moment, our connection to reality slipped further away. Each life event felt like a deliberate push from the game, losing jobs, relationships, a disturbing paranoia that seeped into our dreams. Simon began scribbling down notes, creating a wall of red strings and photographs taken from social media, demonstrating the connections of our poor fortunes as if he were some mad conspiracy theorist. Lucy talked about the strange feeling of being watched everywhere we went, convinced that every stranger held a vested interest in our downfall. It was chaos, a spiraling descent into hell that felt impossible to escape, yet we couldn't bring ourselves to stop. One evening, alone in the dark corners of my apartment, I found the game box hidden away in a recess of my mind and unearthed the truth about its history, a tale soaked in fear. It had once been a popular game at youth parties, yet tragedies followed its play, friends turned enemies, obsessions spiraled, and inexplicable deaths stacked in its name, each player drinking deeply from its malignant well. Faced with the carnage, I railed against my friends with a desperate hope, suggesting we burn the game before it claimed us fully, but they were possessed by it, their stares devoid of rational thought. The harder I fought, the deeper it sank into their minds. Despair spiraled when I made my way to Simon's house, driven by a mix of dread and stubbornness, only to find him lost in the game, muttering incoherently as he rolled the dice. I could see his eyes were vacant, hollow, begging for respite yet yearning for more. I needed to steal the game, set it ablaze, but to my horror, I discovered Jenna was with him, even Lucy was, in league, and as they looked at me with those predatory eyes, their grins spreading across their faces made my heart quiver. "Join us," Jenna hissed softly, So inviting yet so frightening, her voice dripping with insanity. I ran. I don't know for how long, but feverish adrenaline pushed my body forward like a racing train, wheezing breaths pulling me past the memories of our friendship. It became a game of survival, but even now, as I write this account at the precipice of my disaster, I sense the gentle pull of my friends haunting me, drifting through the shadows of my mind. I'd lost them and so much more to the infinite game, and even while I pen these words, the dice slip from my fingers as the whispers grow louder, calling for me back. They don't want me gone, they want me in the game, and I can't escape their tightening grip, their beckoning laughter enveloping me like a lover's embrace, reminding me of the pleasantries of living before I sacrificed it all. Now as the walls of my mind tremble and fade, I can't help but wonder, when you're no longer playing, does the game continue to play you? I'm a private investigator, but I never expected to be hired for something as bizarre as stalking a client. It all began on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when she walked into my office, a petite woman with bright red hair and eyes that sparkled like emeralds, dressed in a vintage dress that seemed out of place in our modern world. She introduced herself as Clara and, with a trembling voice, explained that she needed my expertise to follow her. My first instinct was to question the legality and morality of such a request, but as she laid out her story, I felt an inexplicable urge to help her. Clara claimed she had started receiving strange messages from an anonymous sender who seemed to know her every move, her deepest fears, and even the mundane details of her life, where she got her groceries, her favorite coffee shop, and when she took her dog for a walk. Each message was signed with just a sinister V. At first, I considered whether she was simply paranoid, but Clara's demeanor was sincere, and I could see the fear written all over her face, which looked paler than any ghost I'd ever seen. Intrigued and a bit concerned, I agreed to take the case, thinking it would be just another boring job with a twist of psychological thriller. I followed her for a week, keeping my distance, blending in with the surrounding crowds as she went about her life, stopping at boutiques, her daily yoga class, and the small park where she'd sit quietly, feeding the ducks. Then, I began to notice odd things, shadows lurking just out of sight, people I didn't recognize hanging around longer than necessary, and most disturbingly, the way Clara would stop mid-sentence when she felt she was being watched. Each day, I gathered more intel and continued to dig into her past. She seemed to be a typical woman, but there was something off, as if she were hiding part of herself. One evening, while tailing her to a bookstore, I decided to poke around to see if I could catch a glimpse of those shadowy figures she feared. With every passing minute, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I felt the prickling sensation of eyes on my back. Clara left the store carrying an old, worn book with no title on the spine, and, compelled by a strange curiosity, I followed her home, a modest little place on a quiet street. I parked at the end of the block and watched as she locked her door with shaky hands, her eyes darting around as if she could feel me watching, but I wasn't there to harm, only to protect her. That night, I decided to go back to the bookstore to learn more about that peculiar tome she purchased. When I stepped inside, the bell dinged ominously, and the scent of old paper wrapped around me like a heavy fog. I asked the clerk about the book, only to be met with a glassy-eyed stare and a muttered warning to leave well enough alone. Suspicious, I slipped behind the aisles and, after a few minutes of searching, found that same book hidden on a dusty shelf, slamming it down on the counter for purchase. As I hurried out, I couldn't help but notice the same figure from earlier, drenched in shadows, just watching me from outside. Heart racing, I rushed home to read the book, only to unveil pages filled with fragments of stories about people who had gone missing, impossible tales, retellings of lives snatched away, but they all shared one bizarre detail: each victim had received a correspondence, marked with a V. That night, I didn't sleep. I pored over the text until dawn, and it dawned on me, Clara was being hunted, and I was caught in the web. When I finally fell asleep, my phone startled me awake at 3 a.m. The message on the screen was plain: no contact, but a simple photograph of Clara at the park, smiling innocently, large eloquent letters beneath it reading, "Isn't she wonderful?" Panic surged through my veins. I leapt out of bed and sped to her place, every instinct screaming that time was running out. When I got there, I found the door ajar, a sickly sweet scent wafting through the space. I rushed in, my heart pounding, calling her name, but only silence echoed back. As I entered the living room, I saw the walls were tarnished with what looked like strange symbols, and the only light came from a flickering candle. Suddenly, I heard the familiar sound of her voice, a warped version of her laugh, coming from the upstairs, beckoning me with an allure I couldn't resist. I tiptoed up the creaky stairs, adrenaline fueling my steps as I stumbled upon a room shrouded in darkness. There, at the center, Claire appeared, not the woman I had been following but a twisted reflection of her, her eyes vacant and shining, entranced by something I couldn't see. At that moment, I realized I had become the prey, ensnared in a game greater than myself. From the shadows emerged that figure I thought I'd lost track of, but it was no stranger at all. "Clara," I gasped, an icy dread settling in. The shadowy figure wore her face, a mere mask to hide the depths of the dark energy pulsating behind it. They both laughed, an echoing chorus intertwining and drowning out my scream as they revealed the horrifying truth. I was the next piece in this elaborate ritual, designed to ensnare and feed the void, signed not just by me but a never-ending cycle of souls lost in the chase for something they never truly understood. And in that moment, I realized with chilling clarity that I was never going to escape. I had become part of the story written in that cursed book, the ink stained with desperation and dread, forever bound to the shadows that had whispered to Clara, and now to me. I never thought I'd find myself in a position where I'd be risking my career just to spill my guts about what happened at that prison, but here I am, and if I don't share this, someone might die. I work as a medical assistant in a correctional facility. Sounds grim, right? But I always believed it was a way to help people who'd taken a wrong turn in life. But then, there was this inmate, a guy named Riley who I can't shake from my mind, and trust me, you'll understand why. Riley was notorious, a charismatic criminal who captured the attention of just about everyone. Guards feared him, inmates respected him, and I found myself oddly drawn to him. I was working the night shift when I first caught a glimpse of him in the clinic. His eyes were hollow yet electric, like he held secrets someone would pay dearly to uncover. I treated him for a minor injury from a fight, but as I patched him up, he began talking as if he were weaving a spell. He spoke of hidden depths in this hellhole of a prison and a dangerous game being played in the shadows. I listened, transfixed, as he described a series of bizarre deaths among inmates that the authorities had dismissed as mere coincidence. "They're not coincidences, you know," he said, his voice a low tremor. "Someone is killing us off one by one." I shrugged it off at first, thinking he was trying to pull a fast one on me, but as the days went by, it started to click. The death count kept rising, suddener than an unexpected heart attack. I was torn between the oath I took to keep everything confidential, thanks, HIPAA, and the growing dread in my gut that I couldn't ignore, especially when I realized that each victim seemed to have crossed paths with him. Soon, my nights became frantic as I searched through medical records, poring over the charts of dead inmates, and I found something chilling. They all had a strange condition. Hypercephalus, an extremely rare affliction, marked by an abnormal enlarging of the head, which explained the listlessness seen before death. I felt sick to my stomach. Riley had mentioned those were his real victims under the surface, but I dismissed it back then as a tale from a madman. Now, looking at the records, it was like a light bulb flickered on. If I went to my superiors with this, I risked my job, my reputation, but if I stayed silent, how many more lives could be lost? Panic set in when, late one night, Riley's name flashed through my mind like a neon sign. I made an impulsive decision and slipped a note under his door during my rounds, asking him to meet me. I needed to understand everything. The next day, he was waiting for me, green eyes glinting with an unsettling mischief. I could see he had his own reasons for wanting to help, either that or to lure me deeper into whatever sick game was unraveling. I asked him about the deaths, about the disease, trying to piece it all together, but each answer only raised more questions, and I could feel a web tightening around me. "I know what you're doing," he said, his voice a silken whisper that sent chills down my spine. "Warning the wrong people, darling. You think the truth will set you free?" I shook my head, fear creeping in. But I couldn't just back down. Something twisted was at play here, and my instincts screamed that I was running out of time. I decided to confront an officer I trusted, someone in the right position, hoping they might lead me to the truth. But before I could tell them anything, Riley's laughter echoed like a haunting melody in my ears. That night, I barely slept. I thought about all the people affected, each death like a chink in the prison's facade, but also in my own conscience. By the time dawn broke, I was resolution-bound. I just had to find a way to expose what was happening without endangering myself or anyone else. It wasn't long after my decision that I overheard whispers in the corridors, hushed conversations that stopped as I walked past, sending icy shivers down my spine. I began to realize how easily the walls had eyes and ears, and I was in it deep. One day, I got called to the infirmary. A new inmate had arrived, and he wasn't just any guy, he was another man from the same circle of death, the epitome of what Riley had warned me about. As soon as he laid eyes on me, I froze. He recognized my face from his time in solitary confinement. "He's watching you," he barked suddenly, bloodshot eyes wide with panic. "Get out, now." Before I even had a chance to respond, guards stormed in, dragging him away. The panic settled into the pit of my stomach, I felt eyes on me, and within days, strange things began to happen. Items went missing, my thoughts were jumbled like someone was messing with my mind. Without my knowledge, someone was pulling strings, and each anxiety-laden hour I spent in that prison felt like a countdown to chaos. Then it came. I was cornered one dark night by Riley himself, his offer slithering into my thoughts like poison. "Join me, or it will be death, or worse." When I asked worse than death, he only smiled, and that grin chilled me to the core. I realized then that I had been merely a pawn in this twisted game of survival, one that revolved around something darker than I could have ever imagined. Other inmates were caught in the crossfire, becoming unwilling sacrifices while the true players remained hidden in the shadows, and now I was very much in their sights. I confronted Riley one last time, desperate to understand if he was the orchestrator or just another victim like the rest of us, but he just laughed again, that hollow sound echoing in my mind like a death knell. I felt like I was walking a tightrope over a bottomless pit, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I might not ever find my way out. Days passed in a blur, inexplicably filled with threats, almost like a sinister dance that I had not agreed to join. Then the situation culminated into a harrowing moment when I witnessed something I pray I'll never forget. An inmate fell ill right before my eyes, head swelling grotesquely, the same symptoms I had read about, and everyone just stood by as if it was the nightly entertainment. I screamed for help, but that only alerted the guards. They dragged me away as I fought against them, watching the inmate's body convulse, knowing somewhere in my heart he wouldn't be the last. Against all odds, I'd finally decided that the only way forward was to get out of that hellhole, and I carefully crafted a plan with a few people I trusted, practiced safety in numbers and all that. But just as we were about to slip away, I heard him, Riley's silky voice draping over me like a vice grip, and suddenly it was game over. He had orchestrated it all, playing with lives as if they were pieces on a chessboard, me included. I don't know what's going to happen next, and I'm terrified of what lies behind those walls even now, but my words are out. If someone runs into this, I just beg of you to be cautious, trust your gut, for in a place that thrives on darkness, the thin line between prey and predator is sharp and unforgiving. Please, don't let my mistake be the beginning of someone else's nightmare. For as long as I can remember, my cat, Whiskers, had a peculiar way of expressing her affection for me. She would bring me gifts. At first, I thought it was just her natural hunting instinct manifesting in the form of little treasures, a dead mouse here, a lizard there, but soon, I began to realize these gifts were less about demonstrating skill and more about sending a message. One morning, I woke up to find a small, mutilated bird laid carefully on my pillow. I took it as a sign of love, albeit an unsettling one, but I couldn't shake the peculiar feeling that there was something more to it. As the months went on, Whiskers became more adventurous, presenting me with a growing array of presents. Stolen toys from the neighbors' yards, scraps of fancy fabric, and even the occasional shoe. I often joked that my cat had a better social life than I did. She darted in and out of other people's houses with a boldness that left me both bemused and envious. My friends were amused too, but they warned me that animals have instincts that humans often overlook. I dismissed it. Cats are silly. They just want to share their kill, I reasoned. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that Whiskers was trying to tell me something with her increasingly bizarre selections. The gift soon took a creepy turn. One day, she brought home a bejeweled collar that looked suspiciously expensive. Confused, I decided to investigate where she had found it, leading me down the street and around the neighborhood, hoping to catch a glimpse of the collar's owner. After knocking on numerous doors, I finally found the rightful owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Henderson, who lived alone and had been frantic about her missing cat for 2 weeks. The moment she saw the collar, her expression morphed from frustration to horror as she gasped, "Oh no. That's my Bella's collar." It was an eerie coincidence, the way my cat had found the collar, and something in Mrs. Henderson's voice urged me to dig deeper. I offered my condolences and asked if she had found Bella, her precious Siamese cat, yet. She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes, and I could feel my stomach twist in knots. Suddenly, I felt as though Whiskers wasn't just bringing me gifts, she was relaying an ominous warning. When I returned home, I felt a rush of panic because I sensed that Whiskers' gifts were becoming progressively sinister. She started showing up with things that looked almost human, a tuft of hair that could have belonged to a small child, tiny shoes that matched my niece's, even an old, rusted locket. Each item was disturbing in its own right, but the scariest part was when I caught Whiskers digging in the dirt in my backyard one evening. My heart dropped as I saw her emerge, mouth stained with something dark. It wasn't until she dropped a small, unrecognizable bundle at my feet that my world spiraled into chaos. Stricken with horror, I couldn't even bear to look at it closely. Something told me it was wrong, so wrong. I was well aware of the potential for my wild imagination to run away with me, but a nagging dread pushed me to investigate the parcel wrapped in soil and grass. With trembling hands, I pulled away the dirt, and what lay beneath was unmistakable, a small, human-like jawbone. I stumbled back in shock, the world spinning as the gravity of what that meant slammed into me. It dawned on me that somehow, Whiskers had stumbled upon something horrific, something dark and just beyond my understanding, not just in the lives of the other pets she'd found but in the people who had vanished along with them. The next night, I thought about just tossing those gifts into the trash, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I was too terrified of what it might mean if I rid myself of them and too entranced by the idea that Whiskers was not just my pet, perhaps she was a vessel of something much darker. But what she had unearthed hadn't been just an idle discovery, it had a purpose. I knew I couldn't keep hiding from the truth. Frantic and desperate for answers, I went on the internet, searching through local missing persons reports. As I scrolled through photos of smiling faces, my heart sank with each one. They were all gone. It was the eyes that did it. Every single person had a certain light behind them, the very same brightness reflected in the lost belongings Whiskers had dragged home. And that's when I came across a forum dedicated to pets that went missing without explanation, where people shared eerie experiences that echoed mine, mentioning a gift-giving behavior from their own animals. The descriptions were eerily similar: a stray cat, a golden retriever who had found something bloody in the woods, a beagle who kept barking at what its owner could only describe as a dark shadow. And in all those stories, the gifts seemed to grow darker with each report. I felt the walls of my world closing in on me, suffocating me with their truth. But Whiskers seemed oblivious to every bit of horror I was unraveling. She curled up by my side, purring softly, as if she were my guardian. The next day, I dragged myself out to the backyard again, caught in a whirlwind of dread. I peered at the spot where Whiskers had brought up the jawbone, hoping against hope that it had all been a sick joke. But as I scooped up that patch of dirt, my fingers grazed something hard beneath the surface. With alarming urgency, I began digging to unearth whatever secret lay just beneath my feet, every shovelful of soil bringing me one step closer to revelation. Eventually, I stumbled across a small, weathered box, its hinges rusted but still intact. My heart raced as I pried it open, and when I did, it revealed a trove of tarnished trinkets and photographs that confirmed my worst fears. These were trophies from the past, mementos of lost souls. I felt sick. This was a trophy for the collector, and my cat was somehow a part of this macabre game. But more than that, as I looked closer, I noticed a small photograph tucked inside, a little girl clutching a toy stuffed rabbit, her eyes as glowing as the many items surrounding her. And beneath it, in delicate writing, it read, "For the best friend a girl could have." I staggered back, breath hitching in my throat, as the pieces fell together. Whiskers hadn't just been a simple cat, she was a harbinger of the lost. My heart raced as something clicked in my mind. It was all meant to be. My cat wasn't merely offering gifts, she was carrying out the haunting work of a collector who sought to break the boundaries between the living and the lost. And there was no denying, with the way her eyes pierced through to my soul, that I was now bound to this growing collection. They say cats choose their people, but perhaps I had been chosen for something else entirely, something I couldn't escape. I dropped everything and ran, chaotic thoughts racing through my mind, desperately wanting to escape both the reality and my cat, but as I sprinted away, I felt a chill run down my spine at the reminder of that photograph. All of it lingered in the back of my mind. Whiskers was waiting at home, ready to share her next best gift. It wasn't just her hunting nature, she was my shadow, my vow to the darkness, and there was no running from fate.